Welcome to the Church and Culture Podcast, a weekly discussion with Dr. James Emery White on the latest trends happening in culture and where and how the church should respond. Jim is the founding and senior pastor of Mecklenburg Community Church in Charlotte, North Carolina, president of Serious Times, a ministry devoted to exploring the intersection of faith and culture, former professor of theology and culture at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, where he also served as their fourth president, and the author of more than 20 books. I am your host, Alexis Dry, and I can't wait to dive into this week's conversation. All right, well, thanks for joining us. In the previous episode, Jim and I were prompted by the recent launch of NASA's Sphere X telescope and the answers it's hoping to find, including how the world began, to talk about the biblical account of creation as recorded in the book of Genesis, but not just creation. Genesis says quite a few things with regard to the history of the world that seem at first glance to either contradict science or have not been corroborated by science. Last week, I underestimated how thoroughly, Jim, you're going to respond to my questions, and do not take that as a complaint, not by any stretch of the imagination. But anyways, there's a lot that we didn't have time to cover in just one.
Let me just interject real quick in reason why that I was so excited that we're doing this. We've touched on science and matters before, but because really when you engage culture for the Christian faith, trying to make an apologetic for it, Genesis keeps coming up in people's minds and as a stumbling block. When you are involved in evangelism and you're actually talking with people who have really honest, fair questions about the Christian faith and the scriptures, they're not asking about, you and I were talking about the Gospel of Mark earlier. Offline, they're not asking questions about Mark. They're asking questions about Genesis, or they're asking questions about Old Testament genocide. I mean, they're asking very specific, pointed questions about it. And so if a Christian isn't able to really engage and understand the cultural challenges to Genesis, whether you agree with how I would answer them, how I would engage Genesis or not, you've got to be able to do that in a way that's winsome and compelling and really speaks to the issue. So that's why it's actually perfect for the kinds of things we talk about with church and culture, because it really is such a huge cultural issue. Okay, sorry, keep going.
I'm going to hand the mic back over to you in a moment. But last week, we did, though, cover a lot of ground. We did talk about the creation narrative, the Big Bang Theory, evolution. But again, like I said, we still have a lot that we didn't get a chance to talk about. So we're going to pick up that conversation today. Again, if you have a chance after today's episode to go back and listen to part one, I think you'd benefit from it. And also checking out the show notes from last week as well. Anyways, turn the corner. Let's talk about Adam and Eve. Now, when we meditate, for example, on artwork of Adam and Eve, we're often meditating on images of a man and a woman who look pretty much like us, though just naked. But certainly not like monkey-like ancestors that we've seen in maybe school textbooks. So how do we square these kind of conflicting ideas?
Oh, I don't think you have to. Or feel it they're at odds is what I'm trying to say. If God used evolution to create human beings, the idea would be, which we talked about at length in the previous installment, the idea would be that at the end of that creative process, he breathed life into the first two humans, Adam and Eve. He gave them personhood. He gave them a soul. Meaning he set them apart from all the rest of creation through that means. And that is very important to understand. We know we're different from the animals. We know we're different from artificial intelligence, but what constitutes that difference? What makes up the humanness of humans, and where does that humanness come from? This is another problem, quite frankly, with a purely naturalistic view of evolution, which I, of course, as a Christian would reject. It's difficult to believe that the human personality evolved completely naturalistically out of a pool of primordial slime. Lungs, arms, legs, maybe, but what is inside of us, that which makes you, consciousness itself. When the philosopher Rene Descartes attempted to boil down the one and only true starting point for philosophical reflection, he came up with his famed phrase, cogito ergo sum, which means I think, therefore I am. But where does that thinking come from? See, you have to go back beyond that. How are we able to think and reflect and feel and reason? There's a voice inside my head. There's a personality. There's a living spirit that I know exists. It's tangible and it's real when I think to myself. What is that? And where did it come from? Humans really are different from every other living creature. People who say humans are just slightly kind of remodeled chimpanzee-like apes because we share about 99.4% of their DNA. So there's really not that much of a difference between human beings and chimps. That just loses me. I find that very unconvincing. I mean, as one author put it, kind of tongue in cheek, if you really believe that yourself, and if you wonder if it's really true, just ask yourself if you would have a chimpanzee babysit your children. No, you would not. Or ask yourself if you would date one. No, you probably wouldn't. The nature of human identity is not our DNA. That is not the nature of identity. The nature of our identity is that we were made in the image of God. We have been given a soul, which is why we are innately spiritual creatures. And that really is a defining mark. One of the most interesting manifestations throughout all civilizations is the deep spiritual hunger of men and women. Anthropologists have discovered that human beings are universally spiritual and that they are very conscious of this idea of God. This was described by Blaise Pascal, the 17th century philosopher and mathematician, in a way that I've always found profound and interesting and helpful, which he talks about it in various forms, like a God-shaped hole or a vacuum in every human being. If there isn't a God and we evolved naturalistically, that would make no sense. In reflecting on this, C.S. Lewis once noted that the drives that we have supposedly come about due to the realities of our world. That's why we evolved to have them be met. For example, we have an appetite for food, and there's food to satisfy that need, which makes naturalistic evolutionary sense. We have this drive to know God, an authentic spiritual hunger, but there is no God. That doesn't make sense. If it were true, if it were not true, we shouldn't have the drive. That shouldn't have evolved naturalistically. Why would creatures who evolved by chance as a result of naturalistic causes alone desire and hunger after a creator God, or even have this thing called a spiritual side to their lives? Some obviously have suggested that this is not God at all, but a so-called God gene that's been wired into our genetic constitutions. But why would a gene like that have evolved? I mean, that just to me begs the question again. Some take another take on this, and they reason that we're so spiritually hungry because it's simply our desire for a God, our hope for a God. Of course, that was the belief of Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalytic school of psychology. The dilemma is that it doesn't explain the universal desire for God throughout time and across all civilization. At some point, particularly in our modern context, you would think that the wish, desire, or need for God would simply end, but it only grows, which makes no evolutionary sense, if naturalistic evolution, if there is no God. And where do we get our inner sense of morality? I mean, that's another huge issue. Intuitively, each of us appeals to some sense of right and wrong in our dealings with other human beings and also with ourselves and with the world. You're on a crowded bus, okay? You get up from your seat to go grab something. You come back, someone's taking your seat, and you're only gone for a second. What's your instant reaction? Hey, that's my seat. I was there first. Okay. What are we appealing to there? We're appealing to some behavioral standard that the other person is supposed to know and accept. And there really is a surprising consensus from civilization to civilization and culture to culture as to what is right and what is wrong. When you study the moral teaching of the ancient Egyptians and Babylonians and Hindus and Chinese and Greeks and Romans, you become amazed at how similar they are to each other morally. For example, I was in 1 Corinthians 5 and 6 for a length of time yesterday, because we're in a series at MEC right now through 1 Corinthians, which we're appropriately calling messy because it was a mess. But, when Paul there says to them, really brings, takes them to the woodshed over the fact that there's a man in the church who's pursuing incest, and they're fine with it, and nobody's condemning it or confronting it or dealing with it. And Paul says something really interesting. He says, even the pagans think that's wrong. And here, you guys, what are you thinking? Everybody knows this is wrong. And what he's referring to there are the Romans. The Romans condemned that. The Jews condemned that. and everybody but the Corinthian church. So Paul was like saying, look, even the Romans, everybody agrees on this morally. And there is this moral standard that tends to cut across all kinds of places. So, for example, selfishness has never been admired. Loyalty is almost always praised. Men may have been have differed as to whether you should have one wife or 14, but they all agree that you couldn't just have any woman you wanted. And I mentioned Lewis earlier. When he was in his waning stages of atheism, as he was moving increasingly toward Christianity, as he reflected back on that pivotal time, he said, my argument against God used to be that the universe was so cruel and it was so unjust. But then he said, it started to come to me, how had I gotten this idea of just and unjust? Where was that coming from? He said, you don't call a line crooked unless you have some idea of a straight line. So where did this idea of a straight line even come from? Where was I judging just and unjust? Somehow it seems that we have this intuitive sense of right and wrong within us. And or as Darwin once replied when asked whether man was unique in any way from other life forms, his answer was, well, man is the only animal that blushes. And of course, he was referring there to a conscience. So where does that come from outside of an independent source? I remember National Public Radio, because it stood out to me because I remember I went back and took notes on it and listened to it again more carefully once I just caught part of it in my car. But National Public Radio did a story on the most challenging questions facing science. It's fascinating. And they surveyed a wide range of scientists from different scientific fields. And the top 3 questions will sound familiar if you listen to our first installment and even part of what we're talking about today. The 3 questions that completely stump scientists right now are, how did life come about? Translation, how did life come from non-life? How did something dead become alive? If something was dead, how did life appear? If everything was once dead, how did life appear? There's no scientific answer. The second one is, what makes us human? We have 3 times more neurons than a gorilla, but our DNAs, as I mentioned, are almost identical. Many animals have a rudimentary language. They can use tools. They can recognize themselves in mirrors. So what is it that differentiates us from them? There is no scientific answer. And then finally, what is consciousness? Was the third question that stumped them. How is it that the brain generates the self of self? The unique experience that we have of being unique. And why is there a consciousness at all? Again, there are no scientific answers, but there are theological ones. And they're all answered really in a single line from Genesis. So God created human beings in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. And you have all 3 of those questions instantly answered.
I feel like my next question is going to sound clunky if I don't remind us that we're talking about the book of Genesis, because we're going from consciousness to dinosaurs. That's where I want to go next. Because that's another hang up that people have with Genesis, is that there's no mention of dinosaurs. Now, there is something called a Leviathan in Genesis, which appears to be like a sea dragon type animal or creature, and some believe that that could have been maybe a sea dinosaur. But
actually, it was and also it often interpreted, and rightfully so, as a metaphor for chaos.
Oh, okay. There we go. Well, so anyways, regardless, what are we to make of the absence of dinosaurs?
Well, first of all, sometimes I believe that God made dinosaurs just for little boys. I really do. I was one of my grandsons the other day was in a conversation with his mother about the end of the world and how God's going to defeat Satan. And he piped up and he says, well, I know how he's going to do it. And she said, well, how? He says, well, God's going to get together with all the dinosaurs, and together they're going to put Satan in a washing machine, and he'll go round and round forever.
It's very.
So I thought that worked. But, it's so funny. You talk to them. Dinosaurs have got to be in on everything, even the end of the world and the defeat of Satan. All right, let's talk about this, because it's a good question. You're right. It comes up. It's a fair question. The 6th day of creation that Genesis talks about starts off with the creation of the animals. And it says that God made all of the animals. And as we already talked about in this 2-part series, particularly in the first one, We don't know how long those days were. This could have been part of a very long era. So is this where we would insert extinct species, like dinosaurs, into the creation mix? Probably, even though they were never mentioned. But that omission actually makes sense, the fact that they're not mentioned. Genesis isn't trying to be a textbook on zoology, much less paleontology. And it's been estimated that as many as 8 million species of animals may exist or have existed. And don't forget that the dinosaurs would have been extinct for quite some time before the first humans walked the earth. So Moses would have, at least, unless you believe a young earth understanding, but if you look at alternative views, I mean, they would have been extinct before Adam and Eve. So Moses would not have even thought about including them in his annals. But we know about them, and God knew about them, and he created them. So yes, you can, I put down dinosaurs as part of the sixth day, or the sixth era, if you will, which is another reason why reading the idea of a young earth and 24-hour solar days into Genesis makes no sense. But again, we talk about that in length in the first part, and I would just encourage people to go there, so that don't think that I'm just instantly just spouting heresy. But it's another reason to reject it, because it would mean that the dinosaurs would not have been extinct at the time of the writing of Genesis. Um, and so there's not a single reference, as you mentioned, to one anywhere in the biblical materials, and they kind of would have stood out. And if you already think the story of Noah and the ark holding all of the animals has challenges to modern thinking, imagine if dinosaurs had been involved. You can just hear Noah's wife turning to him when the first pair of brontosauruses arrived, and she would have said, "Noah, I think we're going to need a bigger boat."
Well, you went there with Noah, so let's keep on that topic.
Oh,
I
I
want to talk
did,
about,
didn't I?
yes, you did. So let's talk about the flood, particularly because scientists, much to my knowledge, which isn't saying much, but they haven't been able to find evidence of a worldwide flood that could corroborate that account. So what do we make of it?
All right, let's walk through that, because again, it is a huge cultural stumbling block, and an intellectual one. But I would say it doesn't have to be. Well, first, let's just say Noah, a real life person. Yes, real life person. And the events of the flood occurred when he was around 600 years old. Okay, let's stop right there. You didn't even ask this, but that's the first stumbling block. A 600-year-old man, the age of Noah. Early on, and this is mentioned in Genesis, many lived very long lives, hundreds of years. The Bible tells us that Adam lived 930 years. Methuselah, as the saying goes, was as old as Methuselah. The Bible speaks of long life in the earliest humans, a long life that seemed to shrink as time went on, which some says, see, the whole thing is just fantasy. Actually, no. Here's what happened as time went on, which makes perfect sense. The world increasingly felt the effects of the fall. Disease came on the scene. The decay of the world increasingly took hold. Lifespan decreased accordingly. But we are also told in Genesis, lest we forget, that part of the wickedness of the earth that led to the flood also led God to shorten the lives of men and women to limit their evil, to no more than 120 years, the Bible says. Okay, let's move on to the boat. I think people are used to calling it an ark, and that's fine, but you could also just call it a ship or a boat. The size of the ark was remarkable for its time, any time, actually. So let's ask the obvious set of questions of an inquiring mind. Was it technologically possible to build this kind of boat in that time? The answer is absolutely yes. No doubt about that. It was not beyond the technological capabilities of the day. We know that from the work of the Phoenicians and other ancient Near Eastern groups that we've discovered. The dimensions work out as well. Its carrying capacity would have been around 15,000 tons, which would have been ample for a very large number of animals and food over a year-long enclosure. The ark was covered with pitch, which would have made it waterproof. The roof was probably, when you read it, overhanging, which would keep the rain from coming into the ark. The 18-inch gap that the Bible mentions was probably there to allow a series of small windows, which would let in light and air, but not necessarily the water. But what about those animals? The Bible says that one pair of each living thing was to be saved to repopulate, restock the earth, which raises another question. Many have said that's way too many to fit inside the boat. But here's where we need to be really careful readers of the text. And again, when people say, but I want to take the Bible literally, and I want to say, I want you to too, when it's fair hermeneutically. I mean, yes, but just sometimes you don't take it literally enough. In other words, you need to really read it at face value in light of the exact genre that it is, and just really read it carefully and interpret it fairly. So here's where you need to be careful readers of the text. The Bible is very specific. It said, bring 2 of every kind. Now, the word kind is a laser sharp word. In the original Hebrew, it referred to types of creatures, not species. Types, not species. That's very significant. A lot of people who take shots at this story say there's no way that size could hold, a boat that size could hold 2 of every species, and they're absolutely correct. It would be too small. But it doesn't say species. There was a Hebrew word that could have been used for that, and that was not the word used. It says kind, which starts to get feasible. And don't forget, it didn't also have to include the creatures of the sea, who were not wiped out by the flood. And the 2 of each kind didn't have to be full-grown adults. They could have been babies, smaller versions of an adult. Also, because of post-flood development of different breeds, for example, the way 2 dogs could have created all the different dogs that we have today. When you add all this up, only about 16,000 individual animals would have been necessary for Noah's Ark to repopulate the earth. But it may have needed to hold even fewer, far fewer, which brings us to the flood itself and, yes, its extent. First, is the Bible trying to say that this really happened as a historical event, that something that occurred in space and time? Or is it just an allegory, something of a parable or a myth? Some people want to do away with this purely on the grounds that it isn't even trying to be portrayed as an actual event. But I totally reject that. I think it's mentioned hands down, the Bible is saying this is historical. You may not buy it, but the Bible portrays this as actually having happened, and when it happened, how long it lasted, and down to specific days and months. This was meant to be a firsthand account that had been passed down, so that it was portraying something historical, and as a result, we as Bible believers accept it as historical, I think is a given. But here's the second question. Could the ark have survived this kind of flood? Studies have actually been done on this to see if the size and shape of the ark would be suited to survival under these kinds of conditions, and the answer is a strong and unconditional yes. Absolutely. It would have been almost impossible to have capsized it, and it was going to be able to withstand the conditions. The third question, and it's the biggest one of all, though, is there evidence of a worldwide flood like this? You had mentioned in your question that there isn't. Because if this happened, whether God helped it along or not, there would have been evidence, a lot of evidence. You don't have a worldwide flood of this magnitude and not find it in the annals of history as well as the geologic record. So do we? Well, let's start off with history. It's interesting to note that a major flood story appears in the records of almost every ancient civilization, almost every one. You have the Babylonian story of the flood as recorded in the Epic of Gilgamesh. You have the Sumerian flood story. There are cataclysmic worldwide flood stories found in the annals of the Greeks, Hindus, Chinese, Mexicans, Algonquins, even Hawaiians. A few years ago, the British Museum revealed that they had deciphered a 4,000-year-old clay tablet from ancient Mesopotamia, now modern Iraq, and it told of a cataclysmic flood, a boat 2/3 the size of a soccer field covered in pitch, and get this, how animals entered into it in pairs of 2. It also suggested that instead of a box-shaped boat, it was just how we envision it, it was actually round, which the Bible certainly allows to have been its shape and what it looked like when you look at the text. We tend to think of the dimensions given in the Bible as being a box, but it didn't have to be constructed that way. And the Bible tells us just how long and wide and tall it was. In fact, the Hebrew word for ark was also the word used for the basket that the baby Moses was placed in, exact same Hebrew word. before he was put into a river, which would have been more round in nature than box-like as well. And most ancient ships were round. All of this lends tremendous support to the Bible's account. If everyone, because here's why. If everyone on the planet descended from Noah's family, then wherever people scattered, this story would have been in their history. And it is. It's in every ancient civilization. But the bigger question is geologic. Is there physical evidence for a worldwide flood of this nature? No, there's not. There is no widely agreed archaeological evidence for a universal global flood. And the geological evidence is sketchy and inconsistent at best. There have been partial skeletons of animals found in deep fissures, and a universal flood would account for that, but it's not the only possible cause. In fact, there has even been geological evidence that could be construed to go against a universal flood, such as cones and volcanic ash found in France that clearly predate the flood and show absolutely no signs of being submerged in any way. So where does that take us? Well, it takes us back to a careful reading of the text. Genesis never clearly says it was a worldwide flood the way we talk about the world today. Now, hang with me here, because this goes back to what we talked about in the first installment of this two-part particular podcast in terms of how you have to read an ancient text like Genesis. It has nothing to do with watering down the truthfulness or diminishing the degree to which you believe the Bible or whether it's inspired by God. It is. It's about making sure you don't read into the text what is not there, which is eisegesis, not exegesis, and it's not something you want to do. Genesis is an ancient document. It's written in pre-scientific and phenomenological language, and this is terribly important. When God worked through Moses to write the book of Genesis, it was still Moses' personality and his understanding in 1400 BC that God worked through. So when they said the earth, they meant earth according to their understanding, earth according to their ancient, pre-modern, pre-scientific understandings. If you're going to be fair to the text, you have to use their dictionary with their vocabulary. Not our dictionary with our vocabulary here in 2025. That's just a foundational principle of interpreting any ancient text. What was the authorial intent? Today we know that the Earth means a round planet orbiting the sun in a particular solar system and in a particular galaxy. They did not have that understanding. That is not what they thought of when they wrote the word Earth. For them, the Earth was all that they could see. The world was all that they could see. The earth was all that they could see, all that they knew, all that existed in their thinking. The earth was the extent of their civilization, their culture, their population, their space, their known geography. So when it says the waters covered their earth, it did. But that doesn't necessarily mean that every continent on the planet, which wasn't even known to them, when they wrote it, it covered their highest mountains, they said. It did. But did that mean Mount Everest? Or just the highest mountains in their part of the world they knew, the world that was their world, which were only a few hundred feet high. But they were the only mountains that they knew. And to the point, the Bible never says that the ark landed on top of Mount Ararat. It doesn't say that. It only says it rested somewhere in the mountains or mountain region of Ararat, which are in modern-day Turkey. In fact, what we call Mount Ararat, singular, was only given that name a few hundred years ago. So let's be clear about these things. All to say, a careful reading of the text, taking it at face value, allowing their language to be their language, makes it pretty fair to assume that we don't have to see a worldwide, global, every continent flood here. Again, when you read any ancient document, you have to read it in light of the author's intent, the author's worldview, the author's language, and not impose modern, precise understandings of knowledge on the text, particularly in matters of science or cosmology. Which is why you read some writers in Scripture, as well as almost every other ancient text in every civilization right of the world, as if it was flat. They didn't claim it was flat. They didn't teach it was flat. They just wrote as if it was, because to them, it was. That's the way it looked, and it looks that way to us too. We just have technology through air and space travel that lets us see that it's actually round. But we still talk in ways that are ancient and phenomenological, meaning the way things look. We talk about, as we mentioned before in the first part of this, sunrise, and we talk about the sunset, but the sun doesn't rise and the sun doesn't set. But we talk that way because that's the way it looks. Okay, but to the ancients, see, that's all they had. So phenomenological language, meaning language built on phenomenon, what you feel, taste, touch, hear, smell, was the only thing they had, the only way they could describe things. And when they used it to describe things, it was true. It was true. What they described was true from their, all that they could see. So a worldwide flood, or one that covered the earth, could have covered the highest mountains in that area, which were only a few hundred feet, and easily been contained in the basin between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And a local flood of that nature would still have wiped out all animal life in the region, as well as all of human civilization in that region, because that's where all of human civilization was in the world at that time. It did wipe out the entire civilization of the world, which is what God said would happen. Exactly what he said would happen. And this does fit with everything we know geologically and scientifically and practically, because a universal flood would have mingled salt and fresh water, which would have annihilated all marine life, which didn't happen. But it would have annihilated all marine life. And we know that didn't happen. And it also allows for a smaller number of animals in the ark, cared for by only 8 people, because it only needed the representative animals of that region. And it also accounts for what happened at the very end. Again, this is just kind of details that are interesting. If you're familiar with the story, Noah let out a dove to see if it was safe to come out of the ark. If land had returned, that was the goal. And the dove came back with a freshly plucked olive leaf. There would have been no way for an olive tree to survive the flood and bear leaves so soon if the flood had been universal instead of local.
Well, you've covered a lot of ground, no pun intended, but before we end, I want to talk about why this conversation matters. Well, I'm tempted to say that, there's a lot of freedom in how a Christian can perceive the origins of the universe since the Bible isn't explicit about how it's done. But I also know that science has revealed a lot that makes previously held positions by Christians, such as the old geocentric model, for example, or the young earth theory that you've mentioned. It make it harder and harder to defend. So when science speaks to something that the Bible does not, how much authority should we give it?
I strongly believe that there is a place for a Christian mind and a scientific mind to coexist. God's truth and scientific truth can both be embraced, because there isn't a scientific mind and a Christian mind. There's just the mind, and it's been given to us by God to use. There's not biblical truth over here and scientific truth over there, and they just operate in different realms. No, there's just truth. There's just truth, and all truth is God's truth. All truth is God's truth, which makes it true wherever you find it. And the more you look at science, there is no conflict with the Christian faith. And I really do hope, and again, that when you listen to both parts of these podcasts on Genesis, that you'll see that there really doesn't have to be conflict between science and Scripture. In fact, if anything, there's enormous congruity, and science almost begs for the existence of a God to explain what it's finding, what it's discovering, whether it's the Big Bang or even evolution. And faith and science are just not in conflict with each other. God is the author of both science and theology. It's as if God has given us 2 books to draw from, and they're not in contradiction with each other. And you'll hear a lot of people, within trying to talk about theology and science, they'll talk about this whole idea. Look, we've been given 2 books, and these 2 books are the Bible and the created cosmos. And the great Psalm says, the heavens declare the glory of God. In other words, creation speaks. Creation has something to say to us. And so you have the book, the Bible, and you have creation. The 19th Psalm is the one that is really the classic one in this. First, it says, "The heavens declare the glories of God," as I mentioned. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day, they pour forth knowledge. They pour it forth. And so that's Psalm 19. But then Psalm 19 goes on to say later that the law of the Lord is perfect, talking about the law, the precepts, the written law given to us. So even in Psalm 19, you have both books mentioned, the book of creation and the book of the Bible. Science reveals truth about what God has done in creation and through creation. And the Bible gives us the truth that God has revealed to us as that creation. And so they're the two books, in essence, are one.
Well, thanks, Jim, for having a 2-week episode on this. It's a very important topic, as you mentioned, and it is one that just comes up often, not even in the minds and conversations of those who have yet to believe in the God of the Bible, but even amongst those of us who already have made that decision. It's just not, it's just, it's great to talk about and great to know. So thank you. I hope this was benefit to all of you who are listening, and I hope you'll tune in again next week to see what that conversation will be.